What would you do if you found out your entire life was a lie? If your children, your pride, your joy weren't really yours? If the man you trusted most, the one who raised you, guided you, shaped you, was hiding a monstrous secret? For Pastor Jacob Foster, that nightmare became reality. A DNA test meant for a simple school project unlocked a truth so horrifying, it shattered his faith, destroyed his family, and sent him down a path of blood-soaked vengeance. Tonight, we uncover the story of a preacher who abandoned the pulpit for a knife, a father who traded his Bible for a murder weapon, a man who once preached forgiveness, but chose revenge instead. Was it justice, or was it just another tragedy born from pain? Stay with me to the end, and you decide. I'm Williams, and this is True Crime Intel. And if you love gripping true crime stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because here we uncover the darkest secrets behind the most shocking cases. Pastor Jacob Foster was the kind of man people looked up to. In Pasadena, California, he wasn't just a preacher, he was the preacher, a man of deep faith, powerful sermons, and unwavering devotion to his family. He spoke about God's love with conviction, led charity drives with passion, and guided his congregation with wisdom. At Hope Hill Baptist Church, his voice echoed through the grand sanctuary, filling every corner with words of hope and redemption. To his followers, he was more than a pastor. He was a shepherd leading his flock toward righteousness. And at home, he was a devoted husband and father. Emma Foster, his wife of 17 years, was the perfect pastor's wife. She was soft-spoken but warm, graceful but strong, always supporting Jacob's ministry. She organized church events, counseled young couples, and stood beside her husband as an unwavering pillar of faith. Their 4 children, Madeline, Ryan, Caleb, and Sophie, were raised with love and discipline. Madeline, the eldest at 16, was bright and inquisitive, always eager to learn. Ryan, 14, had his father's quiet strength. Caleb, 12, was the troublemaker of the family, always full of energy. And Sophie, the youngest at 9, was the family's joy, a little girl with big dreams and an even bigger heart. They were the perfect Christian family, the kind people admired, envied, respected. But perfection is often an illusion. The cracks were always there, invisible to the outside world. The moments when Emma seemed distant, the way her smile sometimes didn't reach her eyes, the occasional tension in her voice when she spoke about Jacob's father, James Foster. To the world, he was a revered elder of Hope Hill Baptist Church, a successful businessman, a generous philanthropist. To Jacob, he was more than a father. He was a role model, a man he had spent his entire life trying to make proud, a man whose approval meant everything. But some shadows don't show themselves in the light. It started as an ordinary family dinner. The aroma of home-cooked chicken filled the air. The dining table was neatly set, plates perfectly aligned, silverware polished, a candle flickering in the center. The Foster family always had dinner together, a sacred tradition in their home. Madeline, always the curious one, had been bubbling with excitement all day. She could barely contain herself as she speared a bite of mashed potatoes and turned to her father. "Dad, I have an idea for my school project." Jacob smiled. "Let's hear it." "I want to do a genealogy study. You know, those DNA tests that show where your ancestors are from. We could all take one. It would be fun to learn about our roots." Ryan looked intrigued. Caleb perked up. Even little Sophie grinned, clapping her hands. But Emma, she froze. It was barely noticeable. A split-second hesitation. Her fork lingered in midair before she carefully placed it back on her plate. "A DNA test?" she repeated, her voice light but forced. "Sweetheart, do you really need that for school?" "It's for my biology class," Madeline said. "Our teacher said we could do a personal project. I thought it'd be cool to trace our heritage. I mean, don't you want to know where we come from?" Emma let out a small laugh, but there was tension behind it. "We already know where we come from, honey. We have family records. Why spend money on a test?" Jacob reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. Come on, Em, it could be fun. Her eyes flickered to his. Fun? Sure, we've always talked about our German roots on my side, but wouldn't it be great to see if there's more to the story? And what about your side? Maybe there's some hidden history there too. Emma swallowed. I don't know. Jacob leaned in, his voice warm and reassuring. It's just a school project. Nothing serious. She bit her lip, her fingers curled into a fist on her lap. She glanced around the table, at the hopeful faces of their children. All right, she finally said, forcing a smile. If it makes you happy. The kids cheered. Jacob beamed. And Emma? Emma exhaled softly, but her shoulders never quite relaxed. The test kits arrived a few days later. Each family member swabbed their cheeks, sealed their samples, and sent them off to the lab. Days passed. Life continued as usual. Sermons were preached. School assignments were completed. Prayers were said at the dinner table. But Emma, she grew quieter. At night, when Jacob was preparing his sermon, he would glance over and find her staring into space. Her fingers would rub at her wrist, a nervous habit he had noticed over the years. You okay? He asked one evening. She jumped. What? You seem distracted. She forced a smile. Just tired. He kissed her forehead, dismissing it. If only he had looked deeper. Then, one afternoon, Jacob received an email. The subject line made his stomach tighten. Your DNA results are ready. Excited, he clicked the link. But as his eyes scanned the screen, his heart stopped. It was impossible. The data was clear, undeniable. Jacob Foster was not the biological father of any of his children. Not one. At first, he thought it was a mistake, a mix-up at the lab, a glitch in the system. He reached out to the company, demanding a retest. But when the second set of results arrived, they confirmed the truth. His children shared DNA with another man, someone from within the submitted samples. His pulse pounded in his ears as he scrolled through the matching profiles. And then, he saw it. A name. James Foster, his father. The man who had raised him. The man who had taught him how to be a man, a father, a preacher. The man he had spent his entire life trying to make proud. The real father of his children. Jacob's hands trembled. His breath came in short gasps. The world around him seemed to tilt. A deafening silence filled the room. Nothing would ever be the same again. Jacob sat motionless, staring at the screen. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. It had to be a mistake. His fingers trembled as he refreshed the page. The results didn't change. The room felt smaller, tighter. His pulse pounded in his ears. His father. His own father. His chest tightened, and suddenly the walls of his office at Hope Hill Baptist Church seemed to close in around him. The bookshelves lined with Bibles and theology texts blurred in his vision. The framed photo of his wedding day, the day he vowed to love and protect Emma, mocked him from across the desk. His entire life had been a lie. His stomach lurched. He barely made it to the small trash bin before he retched, his body rejecting the truth just as much as his mind did. This couldn't be real, but it was. Slowly, almost mechanically, he picked up his phone. His thumb hovered over the call button. But who could he even call? His mother was long gone. His church members? They saw him as a man of unwavering faith, a leader, a shepherd. How could he admit that the man he had idolized was a monster? His hands shook as he dialed Emma's number. It rang once, twice. Then she picked up. Jacob? Her voice was soft, hesitant. Oh, he couldn't breathe. His throat felt raw, his pulse erratic. Come home. His voice was barely above a whisper. Now. There was a pause on the other end, a long, heavy silence. And then a quiet, okay. She knew. Emma walked through the front door an hour later. Jacob was already there, sitting in the living room, the DNA results printed and laid out on the coffee table. She stopped in the doorway, her eyes flicking to the papers. She didn't need to ask. She knew exactly what they were. Jacob looked up at her. His expression was unreadable. "Sit down," he said. She didn't move. "Emma." His voice was sharper now, demanding. Slowly, she stepped forward, lowering herself onto the couch across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jacob stared at her, really stared at her, searching for something, some hint of remorse, some sign that this wasn't real, that there was another explanation. But she wouldn't meet his eyes. "Tell me it's a mistake," he whispered. Emma swallowed. "Jacob," his jaw clenched. "Tell me it's a mistake, Emma." And then she broke. Tears welled in her eyes. Her lips trembled. And when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I tried to stop it." The words slammed into him like a hammer. "I tried, Jacob. I swear I did." Her hands trembled as she gripped the fabric of her dress. "But he wouldn't let me go." Jacob's stomach twisted. "Who?" he demanded, even though he already knew. Emma squeezed her eyes shut. "James." His vision blurred. A rush of white-hot rage burned through him. "You're telling me," his voice cracked, "meant that my own father did this to you?" She let out a choked sob. "He threatened me, Jacob. He said no one would believe me, that if I told you, he'd ruin you, that he'd take the children away. I was scared. I was so scared." Jacob shook his head violently. No, this wasn't happening. His father wasn't a monster. He couldn't be. He had been strict, yes. Powerful, yes. Controlling, absolutely. But this was evil. Emma covered her face with her hands. "I wanted to tell you, so many times. But I was trapped. And then the kids. I couldn't let them grow up without a father." Jacob let out a bitter laugh. "A father?" he spat. "Emma, they weren't mine. They were his." Emma flinched like he had struck her. He shot up from his seat, pacing the room, running his hands through his hair. "All these years," his voice was ragged. "All these years, you let me believe I had no choice," she cried. "You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to carry this alone?" His fists clenched. "You should have told me." His voice dropped to a deadly whisper. Emma shook her head, sobbing. "What was I supposed to do, Jacob? He had all the power. He had the church. He had you." Jacob stopped pacing. Her words settled deep in his gut like poison. He thought back to all the moments. His father's hand on Emma's back during family photos. The way she always seemed to tense when James was near. The time she would avoid looking at him during family gatherings. It had been there all along. He just never saw it. His own father had stolen everything from him. His marriage, his children, his faith. And now he would pay. The next morning, Jacob stood behind the pulpit at Hope Hill Baptist Church. The congregation sat before him, waiting for his usual words of wisdom, his teachings on grace and love. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He tried to talk about forgiveness, but the words felt hollow. He looked out into the crowd and saw James sitting in the front row smiling. That same smug, self-righteous smile he had always worn. The rage boiled in Jacob's chest. Forgiveness was no longer an option. His sermon ended abruptly that day. He barely made it through the service before retreating to his office, locking the door behind him. He needed a plan. He needed justice. He needed revenge. Jacob Foster, the man of God, was gone. What remained was something else entirely. And soon his father would find out just how much. Jacob had always believed in justice. Divine justice. The kind that came from above. The kind that righted wrongs, punished the wicked, and restored balance. But as he sat in his office staring blankly at the cross on the wall, he realized something. Some sins were too great to wait for God's punishment. Some evils required a different kind of justice. His hands trembled as he gripped the Bible on his desk. His father's voice echoed in his head. Decades of sermons, words about grace, redemption, and righteousness. It was all a lie. James Foster had built his reputation on faith, yet behind closed doors, he had destroyed lives. Destroyed his life. Jacob had spent his whole existence seeking his father's approval, yearning for his love, desperate to make him proud. And all along, James had been taking from him his wife, his children, his very identity. The rage simmered beneath his skin, slow and steady like a pot about to boil over. His breath was shallow, his thoughts sharp and clear. He had made his decision. And once it was done, there would be no turning back. That evening, Jacob entered the kitchen. Emma was standing at the counter, folding laundry, her back turned to him. She had barely spoken to him all day. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, tension, grief. But there was something else inside Jacob now, something darker. His fingers tightened around the handle of the kitchen knife. Emma turned slightly, sensing his presence. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, something flickered in them. Fear. Jacob? Her voice was quiet, cautious. His grip tightened. She took a step back. Please! The first strike landed deep in her chest. Her eyes widened. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. The second strike came faster, and then the third, and the fourth. Emma crumpled to the floor, her body shaking, blood spreading beneath her like ink on paper. Jacob's breaths were ragged. His hands were soaked in red. But even as he stared down at her lifeless body, there was no relief, no peace. Because there was still one more person who needed to be judged. James Foster's estate was a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of Pasadena. A place of power, influence, a fortress built on lies. Jacob drove there in silence. His mind was eerily calm. The knife sat beside him on the passenger seat, the blade still stained with Emma's blood. He had no plan, no script, no sermon to preach. Only one mission, to end this. He pulled into the long driveway. The house was quiet, dark, but he knew James was home. He always was at this hour, reading in his study, sipping his evening tea like the world owed him reverence. Jacob stepped out of the car, his footsteps slow and steady as he approached the door. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. James was exactly where Jacob expected him to be, sitting in his grand study, a book in his lap, a half-empty cup of tea on the side table. He barely looked up when Jacob entered. "I knew you'd come," James said smoothly. Jacob's grip on the knife tightened. He threw the crumpled DNA results onto the table. "Explain this." James glanced at the papers, then back at his son. And then he smiled. "So you finally know?" Jacob's breath hitched. "You took everything from me." His voice was raw, trembling with barely contained fury. James leaned back in his chair, unfazed. "They were never yours, Jacob," he said, his tone almost amused. "They were always mine. And you were always too weak to stop me." Something inside Jacob snapped. The knife flashed in the dim light as he lunged. The first stab was wild, fueled by pure, unfiltered rage. James grunted, his eyes widening as the blade sank into his chest. Jacob didn't stop. The years of lies, the betrayal, the stolen life. He stabbed again, and again, and again. His father gasped, choking on his own blood, his body twitching under each brutal blow. But Jacob wasn't done. In a final act of vengeance, he ensured that James Foster, the man who had stolen his wife, his children, his faith, would never harm another woman again. The neighbors heard the screams. They called the police. By the time the officers arrived, the house was eerily silent. Jacob was sitting on the porch, drenched in blood. Bible rested in his lap. As the officers approached, weapons drawn, he didn't resist. He simply raised his hands in surrender and spoke one final chilling sentence. "God's justice has been served." The news spread like wildfire. The Hope Hill Baptist Church community was in shock. Their beloved pastor, their Jacob Foster, had been arrested for a double homicide. The headlines were merciless. Pastor's deadly betrayal. A church leader's murderous rampage. From preacher to killer, the twisted tale of Jacob Foster. The congregation, once filled with adoration for their pastor, now whispered in hushed voices, torn between disbelief and horror. How could a man who preached about love and faith commit such brutal acts? But behind the headlines, behind the scandal, lay the true horror. A horror that no one wanted to face. Because when the full story unraveled, the DNA results, the years of abuse, the monstrous secret hiding beneath the perfect family image, the whispers changed. They weren't just about murder. They were about James Foster, the revered elder, the respected businessman, the so-called pillar of faith. He had built his legacy on deception. He had manipulated his son, controlled his daughter-in-law, and fathered children under the guise of family. And Jacob had been the fool who never saw it. At the police station, Jacob sat in silence. His hands, still stained with blood, were cuffed to the table. Detective Laura Vasquez, a seasoned LAPD investigator, sat across from him. She had seen it all: murders, betrayals, the worst of humanity. But this one was different. She studied Jacob carefully. His posture was eerily calm, his breathing steady. Finally, she broke the silence. "Tell me what happened." Jacob looked up, his eyes hollow, distant. "You already know what happened," he said. "I did what had to be done." Laura frowned. "So you admit to killing your wife and father?" He nodded. "Yes." "Why?" Jacob let out a soft, bitter chuckle. "Because some sins are too great to forgive." The trial was a media circus. Prosecutors painted Jacob as a cold-blooded murderer, a man who let his rage consume him. The defense told a different story. They called it temporary insanity. They called it the breaking point of a man betrayed by everything he believed in. But no matter the arguments, no matter the testimonies, the jury had only one decision to make: guilty. The sentence, life in prison. No parole. No redemption. No way out. Madeline, Ryan, Caleb, and Sophie, their father gone, their mother dead, their grandfather exposed as a monster. The system took them in, placing them in foster care, splitting them apart. Madeline, once full of life, stopped speaking for months. Ryan refused to pray anymore. Caleb, the troublemaker, became quiet, withdrawn. And Sophie still asked when Daddy was coming home. They were too young to understand it all, but they would grow up knowing one thing for certain: their family was built on lies. As Jacob sat in his prison cell, Bible in hand, he wondered, had he done the right thing? Had he been God's instrument of justice? Or had he simply become another monster, shaped by pain and betrayal? The world saw him as a murderer, but in his heart he still believed he was a man of faith. He still prayed, still read scripture, still believed in God's justice, even if no one else did. And as he stared out through the cold prison bars, he whispered a single question, one that would haunt him forever. Was this justice or just vengeance? What do you think? Was Jacob justified in his actions? Or did he let vengeance turn him into the very thing he despised? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more gripping true crime stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, because at True Crime Intel, we uncover the darkest secrets behind the most shocking cases. Until next time, stay safe.